Hey, hello, hi. We're back. Today we are going to be talking about Stanley Marcus, primarily based off of his autobiography. So if you're ready, buckle in. Herbert Marcus of the luxury department store Neiman-Marcus once uttered to his son, quote, "Don't ever underestimate the critical judgment of wealthy American women of discrimination. They are never satisfied with less than the best, nor am I," end quote. Though the life of Herbert Marcus is not the focus of the autobiography or this video, this statement had a lasting impact on his son. I'm going to provide a brief biography of Stanley Marcus, covering in very broad strokes his life from childhood in the department store through to his work as the head of textiles of the War Production Board in the Second World War, as well as his prediction of post-war impact on retail and thus textile industries. Born to Herbert Marcus and Minnie Lichtenstein.
He's blonde! He's pissed! He'll see you in the Lichtenstein! Lichtenstein!
Marcus. In 1905, Stanley Marcus never knew a life without the presence of his father's store, Neiman-Marcus. Neiman-Marcus, the well-known luxury department store, was the brainchild of Carrie Marcus Neiman, Herbert's sister, who was a blouse buyer and tops saleswoman at A. Harris and Company, and Herbert, who was a buyer of boys' clothing at Singer Brothers. 2 years after quitting their jobs to, quote, help country merchants in Georgia raise cash, end quote, the trio, which was Carrie's husband Al, Carrie, and himself, sold their business for $25,000, which roughly translates to $723,000 in 2021. With this money, the three entrepreneurs moved back to Texas from Georgia, where they established Neiman-Marcus in, quote, the heart of the retail district, end quote. Stanley Marcus, only 6 months old at the time of the move, literally grew up with the store. An amusing anecdote from his autobiography, Minding the Store, Stanley Marcus noted that when he was growing up, quote, his parents couldn't afford a maid, so when his mother went downtown to visit the store, she deposited him in the department where ladies' dresses were altered, where he played on the floor. Thus, his experience at Neiman-Marcus literally started at the age of 2 and, quote, internal quote, from the floor up, end double quote. I don't really know how to say that out loud. Throughout his childhood, Mr. Stanley, as he came to be referred to, being one of 4 Marcuses at the store, worked at the store any time that he wasn't actively engaged in schoolwork or summer camps. Having grown up in a community where, quote, he associated with Jews and Christians, end quote, Mr. Stanley tasted his first bout of anti-Semitism, apart from an isolated grammar school experience, when pursuing education after high school. It was at Amherst that Mr. Stanley experienced a dreadful year, excluded from the lifeblood of the school, the fraternities, for the cardinal sin of being something other than an American Christian. He found himself restricted to a social circle referred to as barbarians, which included, quote, 2 other Jews, 1 Chinese, and 2 blacks, end quote. However, after a year, he was able to transfer to Harvard, where he flourished academically and socially, even becoming the president of a Jewish fraternity on the campus. Following his successful graduation from Harvard, Mr. Stanley joined his father's business full-time, though he wouldn't become the vice president until 1955. He is credited as beginning the trend of weekly retail fashion shows, which became popular across the country and continued successfully for at least 28 years. He was also responsible for the development of many of the non-clothes-based departments within the store, to include a gift shop, a stationery department, as well as the then unusual men's department. However, it wasn't until 1928 that Mr. Stanley learned the intricacies of cut, pattern, dyes, and fabrics. Under the tutelage of his aunt, Mr. Stanley became an expert on fine details, what he called nuances of taste and craftsmanship, to elevate any ready-to-wear garment that his father's store, eventually his store, planned to sell. This on-the-job education proved to be useful when he would later be tasked to develop clothing restrictions in the coming years. After nearly 4 decades of market success, Neiman-Marcus sensed the restrictions that would come in the Second World War, as well as the need to maintain a certain level of normalcy. Quote, war preparations brought new industry to Dallas and new customers to Neiman Marcus, end quote. Thus, the high-quality goods that the store offered could not be completely cut off. Mr. Stanley's team stated in a 1941 advertisement about Neiman Marcus in wartime, "We believe we have a special function to perform, perhaps more than ever before. It concerns that nebulous important quality of morale. It is the only article of quality that endures. That is why Neiman Marcus has always said, buy quality, and we say it now." In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, Mr. Stanley was invited to join the clothing division of the War Production Board, WPB, which was created to effectively develop the American equivalent to the United Kingdom's clothing rationing program. He reported in on January 25th, 1942. In his autobiography, Mr. Stanley explains that the nature of his position was primarily to gather various representatives from multiple branches of the apparel industry, with the intent of conserving yardage of textiles as well as the labor of manufacturers who could be otherwise employed for the war effort. Representatives include producers of various specialized garments, such as, quote, dresses, coats and suits, children's wear, lingerie, and corsets, end quote. Despite having been previously only engaged in the retail part of the textile industry, Mr. Stanley had to learn the minutiae of the production to effectively write conservation orders without jeopardizing the entire industry. Quote, next to steel, textiles represented the largest single item on the procurement of the armed forces, end quote, making Mr. Stanley and the WPB's job of the utmost importance in support of conserving goods for the war. Through this production slashing, Mr. Stanley was effectively charged with freezing the fashion of 1942. By controlling the popular silhouette, especially for yard-hungry dresses and coats, Mr. Stanley would be able to enact these restrictions without the bureaucratic and tedious enforcement requirements that would be needed at every stage of production. Everything from sleeve length and fullness to skirt drape and length to accoutrements to be used in suit design to vent cuts for suits were developed with this goal in mind. These limitations of yardage fell under a general order known as General Limitation Order 85 or L85. First limitation order to be presented in a full press conference as opposed to having simply been sent out as a statement to essentially be copy printed by the press. L85 was embraced as a patriotic action to be taken by both the consumer and manufacturer alike. Mr. Stanley took the press release a step further by providing the details early to popular magazines, such as Women's Wear Daily, which was therefore able to accompany the release with artwork, making the new restrictions both clear and acceptably fashionable. Effectively, Mr. Stanley and the WPB hoped to freeze the fashion to reduce the desire of customers to purchase in-season looks by making the 1941 look the in-season look for years to come. Say look one more time. Some of these limitations and production mandates included the restriction of ruffling in blouses, whether pleating or tucking should be used, the restriction of pockets with no patch pocket to exceed 25 square inches, the abolishment of bi-swing or Norfolk-backed coats, a restriction on sleeve circumference, reduced waistband size to 3 inches or less, and a maximum of 3 leather shoes per civilian per year. This list, while seemingly long, does not cover all of the manufacturing and purchasing limitations, but by limiting the length of a skirt or the size of a waistband or the detailing on a garment, the textile production and manufacturing industry was able to save mass amounts of material and labor. In 1943, Mr. Stanley spoke for the Fashion Group in New York, where he made his predictions about the retail industry in a post-war economy, specifically speaking on the advent of new fibers and fabrics of recent years. With the restriction on civilian use of the newly developed nylon, as well as the difficulty in importing textiles such as silk, rayon became an invaluable alternative, especially with its ability to simulate nearly any kind of natural fiber, such as the aforementioned silk or wool or cotton. He predicted the exceptional shift in buying habits that could be anticipated post-war to include wider distribution of mass-produced products, especially with the increase in the accessibility of air travel commercially, as well as for industrial transport. Some of these changes were already making themselves apparent, as Mr. Stanley played a key role in the push for the normalization of separates to, quote, make them go further. This, along with the popularization of alternative materials for shoes, clothing, and other accessories, proved that the consumer would not be deterred no matter the restriction. Stanley Marcus, the son of two hopeful clothiers who turned their dreams of luxury retail into a reality, continued to work for Neiman-Marcus in some capacity until he passed the company to his son in 1975. Through his own penchant for retail, eye for style, and his reputation of being a man that the fashionable will listen to, Mr. Stanley effectively dictated the fashions of the Second World War with his work with the War Production Board. While I know that this video was a little bit fast and dirty and very broad strokes, I think it's interesting. The impact on the textile industry is just not quite as discussed, and even less discussed is the impacts on fashion, at least when it comes to the United States. I didn't want this to be a blow-by-blow of his autobiography, but it was really fun to read, and it was free to read on archive.org. At least it was when I was reading it, but I do suggest that you read it yourself. Like any other autobiography, you do have to take much of it with a grain of salt, but there is a lot of existing documents and stuff that back up at least his time in the War Production Board. I do have another video coming out here pretty soon about other limitation orders and other impacts on the fashion industry in America during World War II. That said, I hope that you enjoyed this. Let me know if you want to see more things like this. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!